Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Barsaid. I'm president of the America-Israel Friendship League. Thank you very much for joining today our webinar organized by the America-Israel Friendship League, dedicated to talk about the cooperation between Jews and the Catholic Church, how it has evolved over the years. This webinar is part of our Friends Indeed campaign, a campaign dedicated to help where we can, as an organization, organizing activity webinars designed to shift the attention at home from the daily routine of isolation, information webinars such as this one, designed to educate the audience, as well as our weekly donation campaign, where our organization is making a weekly donation of Israeli sweets to bring smiles to the medical staff as a thank you for putting aside their personal concerns and fears, providing the necessary medical attention to people in need. I'd like to introduce to you the moderator for today's event, Rabbi Eric Greenberg, who is the Director of Multi-Faith Cooperation of our organization. Eric has served as Director of Communications and Multi-Faith Relations for the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, and he was National Director of the Interfaith Affairs at the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, where he conceived and directed the Interfaith Coalition on Mosques, assembling diverse religious leaders to protect religious freedoms. Eric has also been fortunate to have had meetings with three popes, John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, and he has contributed the official Jewish text for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops publication celebrating the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Eric, the panel is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for that gracious introduction. I would also like to welcome everyone on Zoom and Facebook today to our special Passover Easter webinar. At this moment in time, we are trying to celebrate our most sacred foundational holy days and at the same time battle the worst global pandemic in a century. At this moment, it is even more important to remember that we are all in this together and that we have each other's backs. I'm delighted to be able to have with us today two friends and colleagues who are also two of the world's experts and leaders in advancing Catholic-Jewish relations. They have a wonderful program in store as they discuss where we came from, where we are today, and where we should be heading in the future. Coming to us from Israel, I'm privileged to introduce Rabbi David Rosen. Here's some major highlights of his work. Rabbi Rosen is the former Chief Rabbi of Ireland and is the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee. He's a member of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Commission for Interreligious Dialogue. David serves on the Council of the Religious Institutions of the Holy Land, and he's an international president of the World Conference of Religions for Peace. In addition, he's a member of the Board of Directors of the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue. This wonderful global organization was established by the King of Saudi Arabia, as well as the governments of Austria and Spain, together with the Vatican. Rabbi Rosen was a member of the Bilateral Commission of the State of Israel and the Holy See, which led to the establishment of full bilateral relations between Israel and the Vatican in 1994. He is a past chairman of IJKIC, the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, and in November 2005, Pope Benedict XVI made Rabbi Rosen a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great for his contribution to promoting Catholic-Jewish reconciliation. In 2010, he was made a Commander of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II for his contribution to interfaith relations. And as an aside, I'd like to say that that's a higher title than even the Beatles got from the Queen back in their heyday. Finally, in March 2016, he was awarded the Archbishop of Canterbury's Hubert Walter Award for Reconciliation and Interfaith Cooperation. And from Philadelphia today, the birthplace of America, I am honored to introduce Dr. Philip Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham is Professor of Theology and Director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations of St. Joseph's University. Interested in biblical studies, religious education, and theologies of Christian-Jewish relations, Phil is the author of numerous books and articles on these subjects, most recently the book Seeking Shalom, The Journey to Right Relationship Between Catholics and Jews. Phil has served as the president of the International Council of Christians and Jews and as a member of the Advisory Committee on Catholic-Jewish Relations for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He is also the webmaster of Dialogica, the online resource super site of the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations, a group I am proud to be part of. This is a site that anyone who wants to know about the things that we're talking about today, the documents, that's the site to go to. In 2017, Phil was awarded a Doctor of Humane Letters by Gratz College. He's a recipient of the Eternal Light Award from the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at St. Leo University in Florida. Those are the incredible, impressive credentials of our today's speakers. So in the spirit of Passover, I'm going to set the table by answering a question I've heard from several young Christian neighbors over the last few days. Why is good, it's not Manish Tana, it's why is Good Friday and Passover on the same day this year? The answer, of course, is that it's no coincidence. Jesus came to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover at the Holy Temple, which all Jews were required to do back then. After his death by Roman crucifixion, Passover became an integral part of the Easter story. But Good Friday became a day of dread for Jews in some parts of the world, as Christian worshipers became enraged during church services from the negative depiction of Jews found in the Gospel of John, and preachers who wrongly accused Jews of being Christ killers and cursed by God. It was common for Jewish houses to be attacked with stones, and often these attacks were led by clergy. My mentor and friend, Rabbi James Rudin, also of AJC, used to make his annual ritual to attend Good Friday services in a variety of Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant, to monitor what he called the, quote, radioactive level of anti-Jewish vitriol coming from the pulpit. Thankfully, due to historic changes in church teaching and the growth of a positive Catholic-Jewish relationship, hostile remarks about the Jewish people in Catholic sermons on Good Friday or on any other day are considered contrary to the Catholic faith. But that surely was not the case 100 years ago. And I now turn the program over to Rabbi Rosen, who will launch our dialogue with Theodor Herzl. David, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Eric. It is, in fact, a mark of how far we have come that most young Jews and most young Catholics are simply not aware, certainly not in the United States, of how chronic the relationship was between Christians and Jews down the ages, and how much the unfortunate perversion of Christian teaching led to this kind of distress to which you refer. But it wasn't only coming from elements who were inimical towards Jews per se. This was coming from something much more profound in terms of their own theological understanding. And the moment that Eric mentioned that I wish to refer to was the famous, or if you like, infamous meeting between Theodor Herzl and Pope Pius X in 1904, just 6 months before Herzl died. And Herzl was busy hawking his wares around Europe, meeting with the leaders and the potentates at the time, trying to sell them the Zionist vision, trying to persuade them that this Zionist enterprise would be in their interest. And he wanted to persuade the Pope to support the Zionist idea with the argument that actually the Jews would protect the holy sites of Christians, which would surely be much better than their situation under the Ottomans. Herzl did not know too much about religion generally, probably not too much about his own religion, let alone about Christianity, and therefore he was in for a bit of a surprise, because he records in his diaries the conversation with Pope Pius X, and the latter said to him basically, "I cannot recognize you because you have not recognized our Lord. I cannot prevent the Jews from returning to Palestine," said Pius X, "but if they do, our priests and churches will be ready, our churches and our priests will be ready with holy water to baptize them all." Now, Pius X wasn't a particularly hostile individual towards the Jewish community. On the contrary, most popes wouldn't have even given Theodor Herzl the time of day. And he was gracious in the way he received him. In fact, if anybody misbehaved in terms of protocol, it was Theodor Herzl in this particular context. Pius X was actually simply telling Theodor Herzl the way he theologically understood the condition of the Jewish people to be. And that goes back to the early teachings of the Church Fathers, which was that the temple was destroyed, the people were exiled, and they were spurned and hated and detested and driven from one country to the next, all as punishment for the failure to recognize the Christian dispensation. And therefore the idea, and indeed this idea had needed to be able to be supported by some kind of explanation as to why the Jews survived at all. And as Augustine and others taught, the Jews survived precisely in their homelessness and their vulnerability and the detestability that they encountered to prove the truth of what happens to you when you reject the Christian dispensation. And therefore, for Pius X, the very idea that the Jews would return to their ancestral homeland before the Jews had accepted the Christian message was an absolute anathema. It was unthinkable. And he was simply telling Theodor Herzl the way he understood Christian teaching to be. And it wasn't just the Catholic Church. That was throughout the Christian world. And we have gone from a moment there. I often say, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to reiterate, that there is nothing quite comparable to this transformation that's taken place in terms of the Catholic Church's attitude towards the Jewish people. The people who were seen as yesterday, as condemned, as rejected by God, as the worst of peoples, to use the term of John Chrysostom, even as in league with the devil, the enemies of God, the people who are behind all the terrible things that were happening, especially within European society, this people has gone from being the most odious and rejected to now, in the words of three popes, the dearly beloved elder brother of the church of the original covenant never broken. That is a mind-boggling transformation. You have attitudes changed in the course of history, but to have gone to see people as so bad and now as so good and as so close that the popes have used the word that our relationship is intrinsic. We cannot understand ourselves as Christians if we do not understand our Jewish roots, that we have a relationship with the Jewish people that is like no other. That is remarkable. And that transformation, of course, was profoundly influenced by the period of the Shoah, not exclusively, but profoundly. And I think that's a good note for me to turn over to Phil.
Thank you, David. And let me just thank the America-Israel Friendship League for this opportunity. David and I don't get a chance to work together very often because we have a big ocean in between us. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. So picking up where David left off, I want to move ahead from the time period of the meeting between Herzl and Pius X and move to the 1930s and the rise of Nazi racist policies in Germany, and sort of underscore what David said about the theological mindset of the Catholic world that had persisted for centuries and that now kind of reached a horrible dead end in Nazi Germany. I want to talk about very briefly, two leading Catholic figures at the time. A gentleman whose name is Karl Thieme, T-H-I-E-M-E, who unfortunately is sort of an unsung hero in lots of this transformation that David alluded to. And also John Osterreicher, who may be a bit better known, who founded the Institute for Judeo-Christian Studies at Seton Hall University outside of New York. Both of them in the 1930s were horrified by both Nazi anti-Semitic policies and rhetoric, but also by the fact that their propaganda was apparently very appealing to many, many Catholics. And the appeal of Nazi racism to Catholics was something that they both sought to combat. However, because both of them shared the attitude that David just expressed, namely, Jews are under a curse because of their rejection of Christ, a curse shown by the destruction of the temple by the Romans. It's kind of their destiny to suffer until they turn to Christ, which was envisioned in their minds as happening at the end of days. And maybe the end of days was now upon them in the 1930s because the entire world seemed to be spiraling downward into another global conflict that could only be disastrous, as indeed it proved. So Karl Thieme, for example, wrote in 1937 that I can't look at the Jewish question of our day without some sorrow because Jews still don't see that they need to turn to Christ despite their persecutions. Now this is somebody, and well, let me say John Osterreicher too. Osterreicher opined also in 1937 that when the stiff-neckedness of Israel toward Christ is broken and it speaks a faithful yes, a springtime of joy will come over the earth. He also went on to say that if Jews had only accepted Christ when he was alive, then God's kingdom would have been realized on earth there and then. So I want to stress that these two individuals are by no means anti-Semites, and they're by no means hostile to Jews. They're in a theological straitjacket. They cannot escape from this notion that Jews are under a curse. Both of them risked their lives in coming to Jewish defense. Osterreicher barely escaped from Paris to the United States in close pursuit by the Nazis. So it's not anti-Semitism, it is a kind of theological myopia or blinders that are at work. And this is why when the Second Vatican Council in 1965 issued the document Nostra Aetate, which means in our time, one of its sentences is profoundly important, and David alluded to this. I'll just quote: "What happened in Christ's passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today. The Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures," end quote. Well, that in those couple of sentences, coming from a global council of all the world's Catholic bishops, which is the highest authority that there is in the church in union with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, that sentence completely removed the pillars from which the ancient teaching of contempt was established. It was now forbidden to read the New Testament for Catholics in such a way as to promote hostility to Jews. Nostra Aetate didn't mention that it was in fact Christians that had been doing that for the previous 18 centuries. It didn't examine the history per se, but what it did, and its significance lies in the fact that it now henceforth made that impossible. It ruled that as not consistent with the Catholic faith. It also said two other things that I'll comment on quickly and then toss it back to David. In addition to this sort of negative ruling that you cannot say that Jews are rejected or cursed, that's off the table, here's what you ought to be saying. Nostra Aetate went on to say, quote, "God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. God does not repent of the gifts God makes or of the calls God issues. Such is the witness of the Apostle Paul. To Jews belong the sonship and the glory of and the covenants and the law and the worship and the promises," and that's citing Paul's letter to the Romans in the New Testament. And thirdly, and this I think affects all of us very personally, Nostra Aetate, it's a short document, it's only about 16 sentences in terms of relations with Jews. Quote, "Since the spiritual patrimony common to Christians and Jews is so great, this sacred council wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect which is the fruit above all of biblical and theological studies as well as of fraternal dialogues," end quote. Now, that sounds all very nice. Yes, let's talk, let's have dialogue, let's become brothers in understanding. But realize that for the preceding centuries, Catholics had been warned against contact with Jews. They could be contaminated by Jewish errors. And the church had to defend itself against the teachings that were erroneous of Jews. And so this is a 180-degree turnaround in terms of extending an outreach to Jews. And fortunately, there were many Jews who accepted this outreached hand, and therefore all kinds of things have developed since. With that, let me turn it back to David or Eric.
Yeah, can we go back for a second? So how do we get, I think it'd be important for people to understand how we get to Nostra Aetate.
Yeah, I was about to do that.
Wonderful.
So, backtracking a little bit, as implicit in Phil's comments, there were trailblazers, individual trailblazers already coming from the Christian world and specifically from the Catholic world, who realized that something had been a bit wrong with the way the church had been teaching. And this debate, to be fair, was not a new one. But of course, it was the enormous impact of the tragedy of the Shoah that galvanized a re-examination, because while the Shoah was primarily, not exclusively of course, but primarily a Jewish tragedy, it was overwhelmingly a Christian scandal, because it was perpetrated by ostensibly baptized Christians in ostensibly Christian lands. that led many to have a very serious reflection on what this meant for their own Christianity. How could, even if not directly, but indirectly, how could they be party to a philosophy that had tilled the land and prepared the way to enable such a tragedy to take place, if not as collaborators, at least as silent bystanders? So an insignificant examination. Within this context, there are a number of heroic individuals. And the one individual who stands out for us was a roly-poly prelate who was in fact the representative, the delegate of the Vatican in Turkey at the time, by the name of Angelo Roncalli, who subsequently became the nuncio in France, and incidentally played a very significant role, though that's not the subject of our discussion now, in influencing Catholic countries to support the United Nations resolution for the establishment of the State of Israel. So he was a hero in the Zionist sense as well. But he was one of the first people to get the information about what was happening under the Nazis and the extermination. And he had personal encounters with representatives of the Jewish people and was profoundly moved by this tragedy, and was heroic in doing something which for Jews doesn't sound a big deal, but the Catholics would appreciate that it really is a big deal. And that was even to authorize the issuing of false baptismal certificates for Jews at a time when, if you were a Catholic, you could still avoid the clutches of the Nazis. And this individual, to many people's surprise, was elected as the Pope after the Pope of the period of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, Pope Pius XII. After him, the man who was elected was this Angelo Roncalli, who took the name John the 23rd. And John the 23rd, who many thought was just going to be a transition pope of no consequence, proved to be an absolutely dramatic reformer for the Catholic Church. And he was the one who convened, as Phil mentioned, the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, which he referred to as aggiornamento, updating the church. He used the phrase, open the windows, it's basically dusty in here, we need to get the fresh air in. But one of the issues he knew he had to address was the whole question of relationship with the Jewish people. This was something dear to him. There was, of course, a great historic encounter, critical encounter, with one of the great Jews, survivors of the Shoah, a man who had been at the head of the inspectorate, educational inspectorate in France, Jules Isaac. And that was a very significant moment, which we must acknowledge in terms of Jewish, if you like, galvanization of a process that was taking place within the Catholic Church and within the heart of John the 23rd. But as Phil also mentioned, it was the work of many Jewish interlocutors and many of our predecessors, especially in the United States, but also in Europe and different communities, who worked together with their Catholic colleagues to impress upon them the need for the Church, both for its own purification, but especially in order to ensure that such tragedies would never happen again, had to be engaged in reviewing and revising the whole formal approach of the Church towards the Jewish people.
Terrific.
So, picking up from that point, I thank David for everything you just said. It's absolutely accurate. So you have then, in the late 60s into the 1970s, what we could call the first tentative steps toward dialogue. And I'm going to sum up the next few decades in terms of Catholic theology. I'm a theologian, that's the lens you're going to get. And how this new relationship posed challenges for Catholic thinking. In a way, we, both Jews and Catholics who were interested in establishing a new relationship, had to learn how to talk to each other. We didn't even have the vocabulary to use. And when we employed our standard vocabulary, we quickly discovered that we don't mean the same thing by the same words, even very significant words like Messiah or salvation or covenant, that we understood rather swiftly that we each came to the table, so to speak, with stereotypes and caricatures about each other's positions. And so these decades, in my opinion, mark a time of unlearning and of relearning, and stimulated by the earnest desire to really understand one another better, coming with different histories, different backgrounds, of course, different relationships of power over the centuries, but nonetheless, in the wake of the Shoah, the sincere effort to try and surmount that history, I think, motivated everyone. One way of looking at this in the Catholic perspective was Nostra Aetate's implicit recognition that God remained in a covenantal bond with the people of Israel, with the Jewish people, was a fulcrum in terms of Catholic theology. If Jews were not cursed by God, if their covenantal life with God endured and prospered, then that must mean that they remain in covenant with God today, and we should learn from one another's experiences of being in covenant with God. This challenged a kind of received habit in the Catholic world, which is, shouldn't we be going about trying to convert Jews? Shouldn't we be trying to bring Jews to baptism? And in the 80s, starting in the mid-1980s and up through the last decade, this controversy internal within Catholicism, although it reached out into our dialogues with our Jewish friends, of course, kind of roiled the Catholic Church. Because if we're really going to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and say we want to have genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant, as John Paul said in his prayer at the Western Wall in 2000, well, then that means our dialogue has to be free from any kind of motivation to try and bring Jews to baptism. Let me show you quickly a cartoon from Italy in the year 2010 that sums this up rather well. So you'll see that this is at the time of Pope Benedict XVI's visit to the chief synagogue in Rome. John Paul had done that in 1986, and in 2010, Benedict followed in his footsteps. But this was Benedict's papacy, as well as John Paul's in different ways, were marked by controversies now and again, missteps in the relationship as we were learning how to encounter one another in a respectful and equal playing field kind of a way. So you see here, Benedict pictured as crossing the Tiber from the Vatican over to the Great Synagogue of Rome on a tightrope, and he's holding a balancing rod. And in case you can't see it, depending on the size of your screen, one end of the balancing rod says dialogue, and the other says conversion. And this sort of summarizes, to my mind, the tensions in internal Catholic thought. If we're serious about dialogue, then we have to set aside any desire to try and convert Jews. Whereas if we're going to hold on to that ancient impulse, then we might as well forget about dialogue. And this sort of either-or choice was actually presented at the Second Vatican Council during the debates over Nostra Aetate by a number of the bishops in 1964 when they debated a draft of Nostra Aetate. And so with this being worked through, the situation in Catholic theology today, if I could just present three quick quotations, is that that has been put behind us. There are still some outliers that would think differently, but as I think David, or it could have been Eric, said a little bit earlier, all three of the popes after the time of the Second Vatican Council have embraced dialogue with Jews, and consequently in their own different theological paths have come to say we must be engaged in a relationship of dialogue and collaboration. Benedict XVI, the subject of that cartoon, wrote in 2011, the church should not concern herself with the conversion of Jews. And Pope Francis has said, and I'll quote him again in a moment, proselytism is solemn nonsense. Rather, dialogue is the path. And again, this is one way of looking at the developments in Catholic self-understanding and in its relationship with Jews over the past 30 years, to sum it up in 3 minutes, is through this lens of, if we're serious about dialogue, if we're serious about a positive relationship, if we're serious about learning from one another, then this idea that Jews are somehow lacking because in their relationship with God, and therefore we must try and convert them, had to be set aside. And that's where I think we are today.
And I think that the cartoon that Phil shared with us also showed another dramatic aspect of this, and that was the diverse voices you saw down below coming from ostensibly the Jewish community there, receiving the Pope as he visited a synagogue in Rome. And you can see these voices which are contradictory, or they're reflecting differing emotions and perceptions. And indeed, First and foremost, we need to understand that the relationship between Jews and Catholics and Christians generally is an asymmetrical relationship. Christians cannot understand themselves as the popes and the magisterium, the official teaching of the Catholic Church indicates, without referring to Judaism. Jesus is a Jew, the roots of Christianity are Judaism. You can't now, at Easter time, you cannot truly understand what the Last Supper was, what Jesus was doing, what his symbolism means, if you don't have a Jewish understanding or there's no Jewish context to it. Whereas Jews do not have to understand themselves through the lens of understanding Christianity. We don't need Christianity in order to understand ourselves. Therefore, there is a very different, if you like, basis or impetus, I should say, for the relationship. And most Jews that came to the relationship with Christians generally and with the Catholic Church in particular were primarily motivated not by theological impulse or not by self-purification or self-deepening and understanding, which is the case with Catholics, but simply by the desire on the part of Jews to prevent terrible things happening to us, to be able to live in a better world and to be able to advance that bilateral relationship, which in the course of time we understand to be valuable not just for us, but actually as a gift and as ways in which we can contribute to a better society at large for all humanity. But there were those Jews. Please.
Before moving on, I'd just like to make one quick comment, and that is to say, everything you said, I agree again, absolutely. However, the asymmetry may be not quite so absolute as originally understood, since again in dialogue and with historical research and so forth, it turns out that in the dialogue today, as David well knows, that we often are picturing ourselves, namely Christians and Rabbinic Judaism, as the common offshoots of biblical Israel, and that period from, let's say, the 1st century BCE to the 5th century CE or so is the fertile time period in which both traditions emerge out of biblical Israel.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that Jews do not have or ought to gain from the dialogue with Christianity and with the Catholic Church.
Understood.
I think there's a lot to gain through that dialogue, especially in the field of theological discussion and biblical study as well. A lot. But we don't have to relate to Christianity in order to understand ourselves. That's my point.
I agree.
And therefore, the impetuses are not the same, even if there's obviously certain levels of overlap. So you had major Jewish figures like the late, great Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who were totally opposed to any kind of encounter with the Christian world. Basically, his approach was, you, the Christian world, have done so much damage to us over the course of history that you've got to prove your bona fides, at least over a generation or two, that you're serious about in your relationship, and then we can start talking to you. And that's a perfectly understandable approach, but thank God, there were not everybody agreed with it. And there were those, such as in my organization, personalities like Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was engaged in this particular process. And there were chief rabbis within the Orthodox communities in Europe, like Rabbi Kaplan and Rabbi Hertz in Europe, who had survived, therefore Rabbi Kaplan had survived the Shoah, who were really very committed to deepening this relationship and understood that, in fact, a positive engagement was going to be a way to be able to achieve the end results. And if you simply sit with your arms folded and say, I will wait until you have proven your bona fides, you may not get there, or it may take you much, much longer in order to get there. So even though these changes were happening, and of course with John Paul II and his visit to the synagogue in 1986, this was dramatic because most people, certainly most Jews, didn't know about Catholic documents. They might have heard of Nostra Aetate, but they didn't really know what it was. And I suspect that even many Catholics didn't either. And especially as we move now into a modern era where people generally read less and less, the changes were not universally known. But people do look at the TV screen, and they do see images. And therefore, the visit of John Paul II to the synagogue in Rome and his embracing of Rabbi Toth and his words that you are the dearly beloved elder brother, this gave a total new understanding. And there was really a great sense within the Jewish world that we've entered into a new era. And I think within the Catholic world as well, that was very much a new, if you like, dimension brought in by John Paul II's also a penchant for grand gestures and visible demonstrations of things that he knew internally to be that which he wished to convey. So it was really important, but still there was a suspicion amongst Jews. If the Catholic Church really doesn't have any theological problem with the idea of the return of the Jewish people to its ancestral homeland, despite what Pius X said to Theodor Herzl, then why are there not diplomatic relations with Israel? And this was always a suspicion. And I imagine amongst some Catholics, it was also a suspicion. There may be something that was not seen as quite completely kosher in the eyes of the Holy See with regards to Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land. And it wasn't really until after the First Gulf War that things really changed. Do you want me to continue on here, or would you like to say something, Phil?
No, please.
So, as I said, there was some suspicion, but the truth of the matter was dramatically evidenced by the Vatican spokesperson at the time in 1991, Joachim Navarro-Valls, when in the wake of the First Gulf War and the Madrid Peace Conference, the Vatican reached out to Israel to be able to explore the possibilities of establishing full normal relations, not only diplomatic relations, but as they pertained to the Church's interests and to its communities in the Holy Land. And at the press conference, Joachim Navarro-Valls was asked, why are you now, so many years after Nostra Aetate, speaking to Israel? And he said, hey, all the Arabs are speaking to Israel now. Why shouldn't we? And one might have said to him, well, if you are a religious moral institution, we would think that you perhaps could lead the way rather than jumping on the bandwagon when everybody else is there, but better late than never. But what was important about what he said was that he, perhaps without realizing it, confirmed that the problem after Nostra Aetate was not theological. The problem with Israel was essentially political. The Church has communities and interests within the Arab world. And I remember Cardinal Willebrands, who was the president of the First Vatican Commission for Religious Relations with the Jewish people, saying to me specifically that the reason there aren't diplomatic relations was because threats had been received by the Vatican and by Catholic communities within the Arab world, and that therefore they were concerned in this regard. And now, once there was in fact some peace process going on in some form, and there was discussion, the Vatican felt this was opportune. It wasn't only that. It was also a personal commitment of John Paul II as well. John Paul II wanted very much to visit Israel in the year 2000, a year he declared was going to be a Jubilee year. And he'd come to understand how central Israel is for Jewish self-understanding. And if there was going to be full mutual respect, there had to be full recognition of Israel, but also that he wouldn't be able to visit the Holy Land and make that pilgrimage if there wouldn't be diplomatic relations, because Israel had an experience before with Pope Paul VI, which I won't go into details at the time, when he visited, perhaps trying to test the waters in 1964. But Israel felt that the failure for anything to deliver was in fact a slight, and wouldn't allow any kind of papal visit to take place under such conditions again, and had to be a state visit. And that state visit was enormously dramatic because, as I said before, John Paul II's visit to the synagogue said something enormous to the world. But to see the Pope arrive in Israel and pay his respects to Israel's highest elected national officials and to its religious leaders, to see him at the Western Wall putting there a prayer of forgiveness that he had composed for a liturgy of repentance 2 weeks earlier in St. Peter's, asking God's forgiveness for all the sins committed down the ages against the Jews, to see him at Yad Vashem in tearful solidarity for Jewish pain and suffering, that blew people's minds. And that was really one of the most dramatic, I would say the most dramatic confirmation of the stunning revolution in Catholic Jewish revolutions that we've been discussing.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I would simply add, this is a topic difficult to deal with in 3 minutes, but it's in the Catholic community, there is a distinction that has attempted to be maintained, even though we realize that it's not a pure absolute distinction, and that is between politics and theology. And of course, you can't have a theology that is significant or meaningful in the real world if it has no contact with politics. But when you were speaking, David, I was reminded that during the debates over Nostra Aetate, one of the factors that was at work was a real fear for the fate of minority Christian populations in the countries of the Middle East, which were threatened on media, public media in Jordan and Syria and Egypt and elsewhere, If the Vatican came out with anything favorable to the Jews, then that would be viewed as the Vatican taking sides in what was then called the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so in Nostra Aetate itself, you have this rejection, this repudiation of anti-Semitism in Nostra Aetate, preceded by the sentence motivated only by gospel love and not at all by political consideration, blah, blah, blah. We reject anti-Semitism or whatever. And that thread also runs through the decades that you summarized for us. And it's still there today. And I would just add, because this is a long conversation, we should do a whole webinar on this topic maybe, is that in the Catholic community, unlike other Christian communities, there are two important factors at work. Number one is that because of the vicissitudes of history, we have the Vatican that is also a nation state that has a diplomatic corps and has a Secretary of State and all of these accoutrements of international diplomacy that other churches, just by historical accident, really don't have. And that affected the decision about whether to engage in relations with Israel. And secondly, there is also in the Catholic world, since 1943, a very careful desire to avoid what we might loosely call a fundamentalistic understanding in the interpretation of Scripture. And so the Catholic community would, in addressing the question of the theological significance of the State of Israel, is going to be pretty sophisticated in the way it approaches biblical texts. And that's a whole huge discussion that we can't get into here at this point. But it is something distinctive of the Catholic engagement.
I don't think it's something we should skip over too quickly, because of course within the Jewish community there is also a similar debate and discussion. Not everybody sees the State of Israel as a mandate for a state according to halacha. In other words, it has to be a theocratic state. The vast majority of Israelis and Jews in the world see this, if you like, as a historical justice, yes, in consonance with our age-old bonds, but not something that gives any particular theological mandate as such, even though, of course, we have elements within us that do.
Of course.
But I think that it's a very important point you're making, Phil, because there's an ambivalence. If you take the documents that came out, there was a document in 1985, as you know, on the notes on preaching and teaching and catechesis. And the most recent document, a very important document in 2015, that the Church issued on the anniversary of 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. And there's this ambivalence because at the one said Israel is seen as a testimony of God's fidelity, of his love, of his commitment to the Jewish people. That's expressed, and yet we don't see it in any political sense. And to some extent, it's a little bit of a contradiction there. You don't have to be able to see the State of Israel as a manifestation of divine promise and divine presence in the history of the Jewish people. That doesn't mean that you automatically think everything that Israel does and every policy of its government is automatically okay. Jews don't think that. Even religious Jews don't think that. Even those of us who do see the State of Israel in a religious sense don't see that in that regard.
Right.
But
So,
one gets the impression that the Church is still very ambivalent and can't quite square the circle.
and I think one of the reasons for that perception, which is a fair one, is that there's a question internally to Christian or Catholic specifically theology that almost has to precede the question that you're raising. And that question is, and I'll raise it but not answer it, because although I have some answers to it, and that is, does Jewish religious attachment to Eretz Yisrael, as distinct from Medinat Yisrael, but does Jewish spiritual significance of Eretz Yisrael have any spiritual significance for Catholic self-understanding?
I would like to tell you,
sophisticated.
I would like to tell you about a fascinating encounter I had with Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger in
Later, Benedict XVI.
1990, I think it was. So this was, he had no idea, and none of us had any idea that one day he would be Pope Benedict XVI. But I wanted to understand his theology. And it was the late Mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, that facilitated our meeting. And at this meeting, I said to him, he said to me, anything that has theological significance for you must have theological significance for us by definition. I said, that's amazing, Your Eminence, because you know, for many of us, including myself, the state of Israel has theological significance. And he said to me, I know, we have not yet fully plumbed the implications and the ramifications of Nostra Aetate. I thought that was a rather honest response on his part. And
in his writing subsequent to that, he has not yet, now he won't, but he did not follow through with that principle in terms of the meaning of Eretz or Medinat Yisrael, even when he was Pope. He wrote an article more recently in 2018 as Emeritus Pope Benedict, where he touches on this topic, the topic of the state of Israel. And there's just no time to get into it. And there's still an ambivalence there that he hasn't worked out for himself, I think.
But one gets the impression that on this issue, maybe Francis is a little less ambivalent. What do you think?
So I think that we may want to keep our eye on the time so we can deal with some questions, but I think Francis is less ambivalent. Francis took care to visit both a Palestinian important site during his visit to Israel and Palestine, as well as, of course, to the Western Wall and to other places. And I think Francis's approach is one that is much more deeply grounded in a theology of interpersonal relationship, rather than a theology of ontological truth, which is a convenient but perhaps not fully fair way of characterizing Benedict XVI's approach. And for Francis, dialogue is his thrust in every area of conflict, not simply or not only in terms of Catholics and Jews, but any kind of conflict, and fairness for human needs or consideration for human needs drives him very thoroughly, and that's because of his Argentinian background, and it's also because of the theologians he studied in his formative period, and it's because, at least in terms of our conversation, it's because he had the experience as an adult of forming deep personal friendships with Jews, which none of his predecessors had had. I underscore as an adult, because John Paul II had Jewish boyhood friends, but whether they actually ever talk theology, I think is highly doubtful.
Unless you want to go back to Peter.
Well, you're going way, way back. And whether Peter is historically properly called Pope is a whole other discussion. But clearly Francis, at least in terms of post-3rd century, is clearly the only Pope that has had a post-Nostra Aetate personal spiritual formation, and also deep-seated friendships that continue to the present with Argentinian Jews.
So, wow. You know, I feel horrible about having to cut it at this point. We have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to ask, or have you both explore the idea about the monolithic or the not monolithic aspect of our relationship, Catholic-Jewish relationship, and taking it into the future. We could do that in a couple of minutes, both of you. And then if there are any questions out there, I encourage people to ask them through the chat line, through Facebook, and we'll try to entertain some of them before we sign off.
So what do you mean by non-monolithic nature?
Well, in other words, we're talking about the expanding the dialogue, that it's not monolithic. I think that's something that David had alluded to earlier.
Let me start on this one. I mean, we could come to your question, Eric, in many different ways, but let me just state this. It's obvious, but it still needs to be stated that just as people are different, so societies are different, and societies are at different stages on many different issues. So the changes that we've been discussing have in the main been at the Olympian heights. There have been personal relationships, very significant ones. But the vast majority of Catholics and Jews in the world have not been affected personally. And that really is a good follow-on from Phil's reference to Pope Francis's focus on the personal relationship, and especially in Latin America. I mean, Buenos Aires is an exception. The vast majority of Catholics in Latin America have never met a Jew, and Jews simply don't feature on their radar screen. And therefore, all these changes that take place at those Olympian heights are almost irrelevant for the daily life of 99.9% of Catholics in Latin America. But where you have communities that are both minorities, one doesn't dominate in the society at large, and they are both vibrant minorities, even if the numbers are enormously different. And I'm now talking about North America, specifically in the United States, where both communities feel that they are part of the general fabric and have interest in preserving their own character and therefore the principles of religious freedom and their interest in those societies, and therefore see one another as allies. Then you have the perfect demographic context in which the Olympian heights can be transferred down to the grassroots. And the success in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations in North America is dramatic. In the United States, I mean, you referred to the Council of the Centers for Jewish Christian Studies, which incidentally, Phil was present at its foundation, which took place at the offices of the American Jewish Committee at the particular time. And you were there too, Eric?
2000.
Right? And incidentally, if I'm already plugging in your kind introduction, you didn't mention I was also a past president of the International Council of the Jews. So we have another commonality there. But right. At any rate, there you have over 30, 40 centers. I don't know what it is now. And whereas in the rest of the world, maybe 2, 3 at most in the rest of the world. That shows how dramatically different North America is. So you need, for the changes on a conceptual level, you need the correct socio-cultural, political context to facilitate their internalization. And a big challenge for us, for Catholics and Jews, is how in contexts where these conditions do not prevail, which is the vast majority of the rest of the world, do we manage to get these teachings and these sensitivities and sensibilities into the communities and down to the grassroots?
So to piggyback on to David's remarks there, there's a kind of interesting circular history here to some degree, and that is, as we said earlier, the conversations at the Second Vatican Council over the need to have a statement on Catholic teaching about Jews and Judaism was debated at one point in the Council in September of 1964, and there were different conferences of bishops. By conferences, I mean national bishops groupings that played key roles in this debate. One was the German bishops, as you might expect, given the previous recent history, and others also had distinctive roles. The American bishops, to some degree allied with the Canadian bishops and other Anglophone bishops' conferences, also played a leading role, and partially that was because of the context in the United States where Catholics and Jews as minorities had had experience since the turn of the 20th century in working together in social movements such as the labor rights movement, campaign against child labor laws, even the women's right to vote. There was some interreligious activity going on there, but of course more recently in the civil rights movement, the American bishops brought that experience of working shoulder to shoulder with Jews to their remarks and comments about Nostra Aetate and more strong support of it. And so there's a circularity there. The other piece I would mention is that, again, Catholic Church is somewhat unique in having this centralized teaching magisterium, right, situated in the Vatican, that in theory, all Catholics in the world are impacted by its teachings. And I say in theory because that's going to play out very differently in different countries, as David alluded to in a slightly different context. But one thing that you do see happening is that in religion textbooks, when, for example, we're in that time of year where the book of Exodus might be the lesson that's being taught in a high school Catholic text, you will have photographs of a contemporary Jewish family celebrating a Seder with a caption that says something like, "Today, Jews remember the Exodus from Egypt with a special meal," or something to that effect. And although people aren't being hit over the head with it, there's an implicit message being conveyed there that Jewish religious practice is edifying and something that Catholics can learn from. Now, to the degree, that's certainly the case in the United States and other Anglophone countries, but it's also the case in other nations where subtle, what do I want to say, by almost osmosis, there is education going on. Picture of John Paul II at the Western Wall, or as David referred to earlier, embracing Elio Tawaf at the synagogue in Rome in '86. there are lessons being conveyed there that over time permeate even the Catholic community and other parts of the world where there are no living Jews. It's a much more difficult task, but nonetheless, these things are happening and will take time. But so there's a positive movement happening, I think.
Great. Okay, I think at this point we can entertain a couple of questions from the audience. I have one here, and I'll address it, I think, to both of you, with Rabbi Rosen going first. Since it is usually male faces and voices we hear discussing the historic transformation we celebrate today, could you note the contributions of women, both Catholic and Jewish, to this transformation? And the writer refers to the Sisters of Zion, the research of Sister Rose Thiering, our friend Sister Mary Boyce at Union Theological, and the contribution, this person feels the contribution of women may too frequently be overlooked. Can you both address that?
Well, of course, the question has stated the truth. The contribution of women in almost all areas of life is often overlooked. And it's one of the big challenges that we need to seriously rectify in our times. And mea culpa, this is an all-male panel. That's true. That's deficient in that regard. So we hope that we will be forgiven. But then we need to do more in order to ensure that there is more gender balance. In addition to the names that have been mentioned, which have essentially been Catholic names, very important names, there have been also very significant Jewish women in this. And there's both within Europe, but within the United States. There was the late Frima Kensky, and who was one of the formulators of Dabru Emet. Judy Banky was one of the key formulators of proposals that went into the Second Vatican Council together with Mark Tannenbaum. Yes. Today you have personalities like Amy Jill Levine and Susanna Heschel. I'm just mentioning a couple, even within the Orthodox community, and we, I say as an Orthodox rabbi, are a little bit Johnny-come-latelys with regards to the field of scholarship. We have personalities like Debbie Weissman. So there are lots of personalities we can point to, but in some sense, the very fact that we can point to them shows that they're exceptional. And certainly, but things definitely are changing. Here in Israel today, one of the important centers for Christian Jewish studies is directed by Dr. Phaedra Shapiro. Yep. So you've got more and more, therefore, women assuming academic positions. We have the Sir Rossing Center, which was established by the late Daniel Rossing, which promote dialogue with the local Christian communities, directed by Dr. Sarah Bernstein and by Hannah Bendakovsky. I mean, I could go on, yeah. But definitely the bottom line is things definitely are changing for the better. But we have a lot to be grateful to those women pioneers who paved the way.
And let me just throw out Ruth Langer before I let you answer.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Very important.
Well, so I'm not going to, whoops, what just happened? I'm not going to attempt to give a roster of names. David did that quite ably. I'll make 3 quick points in good Trinitarian fashion. Number one, the Sisters of Zion, in case our audience is not familiar with their story, since the questioner mentioned them, Sisters of Zion were founded in the 19th century by 2 brothers who were Jews, who became Catholics, and founded a religious order which had the primary intention of praying for and perhaps working toward, when the opportunity presented itself, of converting Jews to Catholicism. In the middle of the 20th century, the men and the women who make up the Congregation of Zion were already beginning to rethink this charism, as we call it, this mission of their religious community, and became strong proponents of Nostra Aetate once that initiative surfaced. And there they completely rewrote their self-understanding, their self-definition, to become proponents of Catholic-Jewish dialogue.
And were mandated as such by the Vatican.
Absolutely. Well, they had to have Vatican approval to do it. And also educational initiatives of all sorts. Many of the sisters were sent for doctoral degrees in relevant fields in order to prepare themselves for this work. And so in a way, they represent in microcosm what the entire Catholic community was working through in the post-war period. And they're still very much active, and particularly in ICCJ functions is where I see them most often.
And Sister Celia Deutsch, I'd like to throw out a shout out to her.
This is the danger. We're going to
we must apologize to all the wonderful women, and there are actually more than we realize whom we have not mentioned by name.
This can be
Wait a minute, I have 2 more points.
another separate webinar. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. The other 2 quick points I want to make are Mary Boyes was mentioned. My sister Mary Boyes, professor at Union Theological. I personally owe her a great debt because she was my dissertation director. And I often joke that I gained my white hair under her tutelage. And if she's watching, this is part of our regular banter that we have. But clearly she has been an enormous influence on many people in terms of developing Catholic theology that's positively oriented regarding Jews and Judaism. And lastly, I also want to cycle back to an earlier comment that I made, which is there are many women whose names we will never know, particularly in the context of the United States, who were very influential. And this is sort of the bottom up rather than the top down way of theology forming. But there have been living room dialogues between Catholics and Jews going on for decades, sometimes in places you would not expect, parts of the United States you would not think this, but women have had enormous input into the kinds of theological reflection that happens on the grassroots level that informs theological inquiry. And I don't want that to go unmentioned.
That's great. Well, we have unfortunately run out of our time. I want to thank our panelists. I want to tell the audience, this is just a taste of the incredible history and wealth of information that both Rabbi Rosen and Dr. Cunningham have. I urge you all to get more information by going to their websites, to read the articles and books they both write, to Dialogico, which Phil is the webmaster. Is that the word we use? Interesting. And I want to thank everyone and my colleagues for making this happen. This is recorded. We're going to alert everyone when it will be available. And we wish you all a Moadim L'Simcha, happy Passover to all our Jewish friends, happy Easter season to all our Catholic friends, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.